In the spring of 1887, in the Gallatin country of Montana Territory, a young woman named Adela Roan paid $9 for a mill that everyone in 3 counties agreed was already dead. The water had taken it. A spring flood 8 years before had thrown the Madison River wide of its banks, and when the river drew back, it left the grist mill standing waist-deep in a slough of its own, the wheel green with rot, the lower floor a held pond that never drained. Men called it the drowned mill, and they called it that, the way you name a grave. When the territory put it up at auction to settle the back taxes, the auctioneer read the lot twice and got no answer twice. And then a woman in a cream dress and a red wool shawl raised one hand and said the number plainly, and the men around her laughed because she had just bought a building she could not enter without a boat. She did not laugh with them. She folded the receipt along its crease and put it in the brown leather satchel at her hip, and she looked past the laughing men at the dark shape of the mill across the water meadow, and what she felt was not triumph and not doubt. It was recognition. She had seen drowned timber before. She knew what her grandfather had taught her about the way water lies, and the way it tells the truth in the end if you are patient enough to read it. Stay a while, if a quiet story will hold you tonight, because this one rewards the waiting. What that woman found inside the drowned mill was not gold and not a ghost, and it undid a man who believed himself untouchable. To understand why Adela Roan would spend the last of her money on a ruin, you have to go back to the man who raised her, and to the trade he left in her hands. His name was Eli Roan, and he had been a millwright, which in that country meant a man who built and balanced the machinery that ground a valley's wheat into its winter bread. A millwright was part carpenter and part smith, and part something rarer, a reader of moving water, a man who could stand at the head of a race and know by the sound and the pull how much power the stream would give and where it would be lost. Eli had built mills from the Bitterroot to the Yellowstone, and he had taught his granddaughter at his elbow from the time she was tall enough to hold the far end of a level. He taught her that wood under water does not simply rot. He taught her that a flood leaves a record, a line on every post and beam, and that the line never lies about how high the water stood or how long it stayed. He taught her that the worst-built mill in the country might hide the soundest timber, and the proudest mill might be sitting on a sill that was already gone soft. Most of all, he taught her to look at the thing itself, and not at what people said about the thing. Because people, he said, repeat each other, and water does not. He had died in the autumn before the auction, of a cough that the long winters had been building in him for years, and he had left her almost nothing but his name, his chest of tools, and the way of seeing he had spent a life pressing into her. She was 26 years old. She had buried him on a rise above the river, and she had sat afterward in the empty cabin with his level across her knees, the long wooden body of it worn pale where 2 generations of roan hands had gripped it, and she had understood that she was now the only person alive who carried what he had carried. The chest of tools held a broad axe and an adze, a set of augers in graduated sizes, chisels and slicks and a draw knife, a plumb bob on a braided cord, and the level which was the oldest thing in it, and the thing she valued most. There was also a folding rule of boxwood, and a small brass instrument her grandfather had called a water glass, which was nothing more than a bent tube he used to find true level over distance by the standing of water in its 2 ends. These were not the tools of a woman expected to do anything in that country but marry and keep a house. She had heard that expectation spoken to her face more than once, and she had let it pass over her the way she let the wind pass, because she had work to do, and the work did not care. The drowned mill had belonged to a man named Joss Hartwell before the flood, And the story the valley told about Hartwell was a simple one. The kind of story that is simple because the truth has been worn off it. Hartwell had built the mill. The story went in a bad spot, too low against the river, and the flood had punished his greed, and he had lost everything and gone away broken. And the mill had stood drowning ever since as a kind of warning. People liked the story. It let them feel that the river was just and that ruin came to men who reached too far. Adela had heard that story too, and she had not believed the shape of it because she had walked the ground. In the weeks before the auction, she had crossed the water meadow on a fallen cottonwood and stood at the edge of the held pond and looked at the mill the way her grandfather had taught her to look. And what she saw did not match the story. A man does not build a sound mill, and the bones of this one were sound, in a spot a millwright would call bad. The race was cut clean and true. The foundation, where she could see it above the water, was dressed stone-laid by someone who knew the weight he was carrying. Whoever built this mill had known exactly what he was doing. The flood that drowned it had not come because the builder was a fool. It had come for some other reason, and the other reason was sitting under 8 years of standing water, waiting. What she did not yet know was that the reason had a name, and that the name belonged to a living man who had grown rich in the years since, and who would have paid a great deal more than $9 to keep that water exactly where it was. She came to the mill to live in the first week of May, when the snowmelt had the river running high and brown, and the meadow was a sheet of standing silver in the early light. She set her camp on the dry rise above the slough, a wedge tent and a fire ring, and her grandfather's tool chest under an oiled canvas, and she began the slow work of learning the drowned thing by hand. She could not drain it yet. The river was too high, and the slough was fed from the river through a low place in the bank, and until the water dropped in the heat of summer, there was nothing to do but study and prepare. So she studied. She waded the shallows in her grandfather's tall boots and read the floodline on every surface she could reach. And she began to understand that the held pond was shallower than it looked, that the mill stood on ground that was not naturally low at all, and that the water sat in it because something had been done to the bank to make the water sit. An old man came to watch her on the third day. He came on a mule and sat it at the edge of the meadow for a long while before he spoke. A lean, weathered man past 70 with a white stubble and a way of holding still that told her he had spent his life around animals. His name was Purnell Cobb, and he had run cattle in that valley since before the war. And he remembered, he said, when the drowned mill was the busiest building between Bozeman and the lake. He said it the way a man says a thing he has wanted to say for years and found no one to say it to. She asked him to sit by her fire, and he did. And over a tin cup of coffee, he told her what the valley had forgotten on purpose. The mill had been built by a Welshman named Owen Price, not by Joss Hartwell. And Owen Price had been the finest millwright Cobb ever knew, and the mill had ground grain for 40 families, and ground it honest, which Cobb said with a weight on the word honest that made Adela set her cup down and listen. Hartwell had not built the mill. Hartwell had been the man who lent Price the money to build it, and when the mill prospered, Hartwell had wanted the whole of it, and there had been a dispute over the deed and the water rights that no one in the valley had ever fully understood. And then the flood had come, and Owen Price had drowned in his own mill on the night the river rose, and Hartwell had collected on the ruin and moved to the county seat and become, in the years since, a man of property and standing whom it did not pay to cross. Adela asked the question that her grandfather would have asked. She asked whether the flood had come from the river or from the bank. Cobb looked at her a long moment, an old man measuring a young woman, and he said that he had wondered that very thing for 8 years and had never once been able to say it aloud to a soul who would not laugh at him. He said the river had not been especially high the night Price drowned. He said he had ridden the bank himself 2 days after and found the low place where the water came through, and that the low place had looked to him less like something the river had torn and more like something a man had dug. And then, he said, the county had declared it an act of God, and Hartwell had paid for Price's headstone out of what he called Christian charity. And after that, a man learned to keep such wonderings to himself. That night, Adela sat late by her fire with the level across her knees, and she made a decision that would cost her the whole summer. She would drain the mill, not for the building which she could have abandoned and lost nothing she had not already spent. She would drain it because a true millwright had drowned in it, and because the water was hiding the reason, and because she was the only person left in that country who knew how to read what the water had been hiding. Her grandfather had taught her that water tells the truth in the end. She meant to give it the chance. Have you ever known a thing in your bones that no one around you would credit, and waited years for the proof to surface? Hold on to that feeling. She held on to it through everything that came next. The draining could not begin until the river dropped, and the river did not drop until July, and so she spent June making herself ready and making the valley used to the sight of her. She walked into the town of Cole's Ferry, a single street of false-fronted buildings on the road to the county seat, and she bought what little she could afford, and she bore the talk. The feed store smelled of molasses and dust, and 3 men stood at the counter who did not lower their voices when she came in. They had a joke they were pleased with, that the new owner of the drowned mill had bought herself a fish pond and would be charging admission, and a second one behind it, that she ought to stock it with trout and at least eat off her bargain. She let them have it. She bought a coil of tarred line and a box of cut nails and a sack of cornmeal, and she counted her coins out on the counter without hurry, and the storekeeper, a heavy man with ink on his fingers, watched her with an expression that was not quite mockery, as though some part of him was doing a sum he could not make. Come out. An old woman who kept the boarding house, a Mrs. Tandy with sharp eyes and a kinder heart than her mouth let on, stopped her on the boardwalk and told her plainly that she was a fool to throw good labor after a dead building. She said it the way a woman says a thing she has decided someone needs to hear, whether they want it or not. She said Joss Hartwell still held paper on half the valley and did not care to be reminded of the mill, and that he had a long memory and a longer reach, and that a wise young woman would sell the lot to him for whatever he offered and go somewhere the ground was dry, and the men were not waiting to see her fail. Adela thanked her for the warning and meant the thanks, and didn't take the advice. Mrs. Tandy looked at her a moment longer, and something in the old woman's face shifted, as though she had filed the young woman away under a heading she did not yet have a name for. Word of her, she came to learn, traveled faster than she did. Within a fortnight, a rider came out from the county seat, a smooth, well-dressed man on a good horse, who introduced himself as an agent acting for an interested party, and who offered her on the spot $40 for the mill lot, sight unseen, papers to be drawn in town. It was more than 4 times what she had paid. He smiled when he named it, the smile of a man who expects gratitude. She asked him plainly who the interested party was. He said that was not material to the offer. She said then the offer was not material to her, and she went back to her work, and the agent sat his horse a while watching her wade the slough with a sounding pole, and then he rode away, and she understood that she had been right about something, because no man pays $40 for a fish pond. The river crested in the last week of June, and then, as the heat came down hard and dry on the valley, it began at last to fall. By the second week of July, the meadow had gone from silver to a cracked gray, and the slough that fed the drowned mill had shrunk back toward the low place in the bank, and Adela could see for the first time the shape of the work in front of her. The mill sat in a basin. The basin was held full by water creeping through the dug-out low place in the riverbank, and below the mill, where the old tail race ran off toward a coulee, someone had long ago choked the channel with stone and earth so that the basin could not drain. To free the mill, she would have to do two things. She would have to close the low place in the bank against the river, and she would have to open the choked tail race and let 8 years of standing water run down the coulee to the flat below. It was the work of one woman with hand tools against the patient engineering of a flood that had been made, not suffered. She began with the bank. She cut willow and cottonwood from the breaks upstream and dragged it down a length at a time, and she drove stakes and wove a wall of brush and packed it with the cracked gray clay of the dry meadow. Building a barrier across the low place the way her grandfather had taught her to build a temporary cofferdam, keying it into the firm ground at either end so the river could not simply shoulder around it. She worked from first light, when the meadow was still cool, until the sun stood high enough to turn the clay to a baking weight in her hands, and then again in the long gold of evening. The work took her 11 days. The clay tore her hands until she wrapped them in strips of flour sacking, and the willow whipped her face, and the sun stood over the meadow without mercy, and twice the first wall she built slumped and let the river back in. The first time she stood in the gap to her thighs in cold brown water and watched a week of labor go soft and slide, and she did not curse it because her grandfather had taught her that a slump is the river telling you where you were wrong, and a millwright who listens is given the answer for free. She had keyed the wall too shallow at the north end. The second wall she keyed 2 feet deeper into the firm ground, and when it slumped again, it was the brush facing that failed, and not the key, and she learned from that one too, and laid the next facing tight and overlapped like shingles against the current. Purnell Cobb came down most mornings on his mule, and lent what an old man's strength could lend, holding stakes against the maul, packing clay with his boots, saying little and seeing much. On the 12th day, the river stopped coming through. The basin, cut off from its source, stood still and dark and waiting to be let go. Then she went at the tail race. The choked channel below the mill was a packed mass of river stone and silt grown over with grass, and she opened it the way you eat a mountain, one stone at a time. She worked with a long iron bar and a shovel, and her grandfather's adze for the roots and the water, sensing the opening before she could see it herself, began to seep and then to trickle, and then, on the afternoon of the 3rd day, to run. She would remember that afternoon for the rest of her life. She pulled one flat stone the size of a wagon seat out of the channel, and the basin behind her made a sound she had never heard a body of water make, a long, low groan as 8 years of held pressure found its road downhill, and the water went out of the drowned mill in a brown rush that took 2 full days and a night to empty. And she sat on the bank in the dark and listened to it go. What it left behind, when it was gone, was a thing out of a sealed tomb. The lower floor of the mill emerged from the falling water inch by inch over those 2 days, slick and black, and hung with 8 years of riverweed, and the smell of it was the smell of the bottom of the world, cold mud and old iron and rot. Yet the bones stood. The great oak posts her grandfather would have admired stood plumb and sound under their slime, because oak that is always wet does not rot the way oak that wets and dries will rot. And the water that had drowned the mill had also, in its way, preserved it. She walked into the lower floor in the gray light of the second morning with her grandfather's level in her hand and her heart going hard, and she saw the millstones still seated in their housing, and the iron gudgeons of the great shaft still in their bearings, and the whole patient machinery of a working mill standing exactly as it had stood the night the water came, furred with weed, frozen in its last moment, waiting. And she saw, against the far wall where the floods of years had pressed it, a man's wooden chest, iron-banded, swollen and black, sitting where it had floated and settled and been held down by the weight of the water above it for 8 years. She did not open it that morning. She had learned from her grandfather a kind of patience that looked from the outside like slowness and was, in fact, respect. The chest had waited 8 years. It could wait until she had dried her hands and brought a lamp and could give it the attention it was owed. She spent that day clearing the lower floor of weed and muck, and she found other things as the floor came clear. A millwright's bench still bolted to the wall, a rack of tools rusted into ghosts of themselves, and on the bench, under a coping of dried silt, a slate on which someone had once written in chalk, and which the water had wiped as clean as the day it was quarried. Owen Price had stood at that bench. She was standing where a man had drowned, and she worked through the day with the gravity that knowledge laid on her, and she did not hurry. When the light failed, she brought the lamp down and knelt before the iron-banded chest and worked its swollen lid. The wood had warped so that the lid would not lift, and she did not force it, because forcing it would have splintered what was inside. She took her grandfather's chisels and her draw knife, and she pared the swollen wood down along the seam, slow and even, the way she would have trued a warped door, until the lid came free clean in her 2 hands. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that the water had darkened but not breached, sat the private papers of Owen Price. The oilcloth had done its work. The river had pressed on that chest for 8 years and had not gotten in. She lifted the bundle out and unwound it on the dry boards of the upper floor by lamplight, and there, brown at the edges but whole and legible, was the record of everything the valley had agreed to forget. There was the original deed to the mill and the 40 acres around it, made out to Owen Price and recorded, the paper said, in the territorial office at Helena in the spring of 1876. There was a loan agreement between Price and Joss Hartwell, in which Hartwell advanced the money for the machinery against a share of the mill's earnings. A fair paper, a partnership and not a forfeiture. And there was a second set of papers later, in a different ink, that told the rest. A demand from Hartwell that Price sign over the whole of the deed against a debt that the loan agreement plainly showed had already been mostly repaid. A letter in Price's own careful hand, a copy he had kept, refusing and stating that the water rights to the race were his by first appropriation, recorded and witnessed, and that no court in the territory would take them from a man who had filed them honestly. And beneath that, a thing that made Adela sit back on her heels in the lamplight, a survey of the riverbank, drawn in Price's hand, dated 2 weeks before the flood, marking the low place where the bank might be cut, and noting in a millwright's plain words that the cut would throw the river into his basin and drown the mill, and that he believed Hartwell meant to have it dug. Owen Price had known. He had seen it coming, and had written it down, and had sealed it in oilcloth in an iron chest. The one thing in the mill that might survive the water he knew was coming, and he had not gotten himself out in time, or had not believed a man would truly do it. And the river had come through the cut bank in the night, and the mill had drowned with its maker inside it. He had left the truth where only another millwright would think to look, in the one container built to keep the water out, and he had trusted that someday the water would fall, and someone who knew how to read it would come. She had come. 8 years late, for $9 she had come. There is a particular silence that falls when a thing long buried comes into the light, and Adela sat in it a long while before she wrapped the papers again and put them in her grandfather's tool chest where they would stay dry. She did not weep, though there was grief in her for a man she had never met. What she felt mostly was the cold clarity of the work ahead, because finding the truth and proving it were two different labors, and she had only finished the first. She did not go to the law. Her grandfather had taught her to distrust a hurried accusation, and she knew that Joss Hartwell held paper on half the valley and friends in the county seat, and that a woman walking into the courthouse with a bundle of water-stained papers and a story about a cut bank would be turned out as a fortune hunter before noon. She needed the papers to be heard by someone who could not be dismissed, and she needed the cut bank itself to be seen and measured before the next high water erased it. And she needed witnesses who had no reason to love her and every reason to fear the man she meant to expose. She started with the bank. She brought Pernell Cobb down to the low place she had walled off, and together they cleared the brush and clay from her own cofferdam, so the original cut showed plain, and she set her grandfather's level on it and shot the line of it against the natural bank on either side, and the numbers told the story Price's survey had told. The low place was not a place the river had worn. Its bottom was flat, and its sides were straight, and it sat a full 4 feet below the natural lip of the bank to either side, a channel dug by men to a depth and a width that the river would never have cut on its own. Cobb stood looking at the level a long time. He said that he had known it for 8 years in his gut, and that it was a different thing to see it true on the glass. He said he would say so to any man who asked, and to a good many who did not. She measured everything. She made her own survey on paper, careful as her grandfather had taught her, with distances and depths and the standing of the old floodline on the millposts, and she tied it to Price's survey so that the two papers, the dead man's and the living woman's, said the same thing in the same plain language 8 years apart. And she went looking for the men who had dug the cut, because a channel 4 feet deep and 40 feet long is not dug by one man in a night, and men who dig such a thing do not all stay quiet forever. Cobb knew where to look. There had been a crew of 3 Hartwell kept in those years for rough work, and one of them, a man named Dabney, had drunk himself out of Hartwell's keeping and into a hard old age on the charity of a sister near Cole's Ferry. Adela went to him. She did not accuse him and she did not threaten him. She sat in his sister's yard on an upturned bucket in the shade of a chokecherry, and she told him plainly what she had found in the mill, and she showed him Price's survey with the cut marked on it, and she asked him only whether the dead man had drawn it true. The old digger's hands shook on the paper, and not all of it was the drink. He looked at the cut mark a long time, at the 4 feet of depth the dead man had predicted 2 weeks before the water came, and his face worked. He had carried the thing 8 years, and it had not sat lightly on him. It had soured every year he had left. He told her that Hartwell had paid them each $4 to open the bank in the dark of an August night, and had told them it was to drain a marsh that bred fever, and that they had gone at it with picks and a slip scraper and a borrowed team, and had not understood, had truly not understood, until the water was already running black toward the mill, that there were lamps still lit in the windows down there. He said he had seen the lamplight on the water and known all at once what they had done, and he had tried to shout a warning, and the cold and the dark had taken his voice. And by the time any sound came out of him, the lower windows were already gone under. He said he had not slept a whole night since. He said he would put his mark to all of it if it would let him sleep one night before he died. She wrote it down in his own words, slow, reading each line back to him so he knew she had it right. And he made his mark at the bottom, a shaky cross, and Cobb signed his full name beneath it as witness, and she folded it in with the rest. Now she had the dead man's record, and the living digger's confession, and the cut bank measured true, and a witness in Cobb who the valley respected. She had built, stone by stone and paper by paper, a thing that couldn't be laughed out of a courtroom. And still she did not run to the county seat. She did one more thing first, and it was the thing that told who she was. She found Owen Price's family. The deed and the letters gave her the name of a sister he had written to in Wales, and a longer search through Mrs. Tandy, who knew everyone's business for 100 miles, turned up a nearer truth. Owen Price had a daughter. She had been a child of 7 the year her father drowned, and her mother had died of the grief and the want within the year, and the girl had been taken in by a farming family on the far side of the valley and raised as their own under another name. And she was 15 now and did not know that the busiest mill between Bozeman and the lake had once been her father's, or that her father had been murdered for it. Her name was Nan. Adela did not go to her with papers. She went to the family that had raised her, good people named Voss who had asked for nothing and given a great deal, and she told them what she had found, and she let them decide together how much a 15-year-old girl should be told and when. It was the Vosses in the end, and not Adela, who carried the matter to the law, and that was as Adela wanted it, because a grieving family asking for justice for a drowned father is a thing no county can wave away as a fortune hunter's tale. The papers, though, were Adela's, and the survey was Adela's, and when the territorial court at Helena at last took up the matter of the death of Owen Price and the title to the mill on the Madison, it was Adela Roan who stood up in a borrowed dark dress and laid her grandfather's level on the table as plainly as she had laid it on the cut bank, and explained to men who had never built anything how water is made to lie, and how it can be made to tell the truth. She did not accuse Joss Hartwell with her voice. She let the papers accuse him. She read Price's survey and set beside it her own, and the numbers matched. She read the loan agreement that showed the debt repaid, and set beside it Hartwell's demand for the whole deed, and the greed showed plain. She read Dabney's marked confession and named Cobb, who sat in the room, as the witness to the cut. And she did the thing that her grandfather would have been proudest of. She offered the court not a story, but a measurement, and she invited any man who doubted her to ride out to the Madison and put his own level on the cut bank, while the summer drought still held it bare, because the same dry season that had let her drain the mill had also, she said, left the dug channel standing open and naked for any honest eye to read. The drought that the valley had cursed all summer was the very thing that proved her right. Joss Hartwell was not in the room. He had been a man of property and standing for 8 years, and standing was a thing he understood, and when the papers came up out of the mill, he had been the first in the county to grasp what they meant. He did not come to court to be undone in front of men who had shaken his hand. The court sent for him and he was already gone, north and then west, leaving his property to the claims against it, and the valley that had feared him discovered, as valleys do, that a man who runs from a measurement was never as solid as his good horse and his smooth agent had made him seem. He was not hunted, and he was not shot, and he was not dragged back in chains. He simply stopped mattering, which for a man who had built his whole life on mattering was its own kind of drowning. The court restored the deed of the mill and the 40 acres and the water rights of first appropriation to the estate of Owen Price, and named his daughter Nan the heir, with the Vosses as her guardians until she came of age. The judgment took the better part of a year to grind through, the way the law grinds, and Adela was not made rich by any part of it, and had never expected to be. She had paid $9 for a drowned mill, and she had spent a summer and her grandfather's teaching on a dead man she never knew. And what she got back was not money. What she got back was the thing itself, set right. She stayed to rebuild it. That surprised the valley more than anything else she had done. She might have taken her vindication and gone, but a millwright does not leave a sound mill drowned, and the bones of Owen Price's mill were sound, as she had known from the first day they were. With the deed clear and Nan's guardians willing, Adela spent the next 2 years putting the drowned mill back to work. She rehung the great wheel and trued the shaft and dressed the millstones, and she taught the work as she did it, because the girl Nan, when she was old enough to be told the whole of it, did not weep and did not rage, but came down to the mill and asked to be shown how it ran. She had her father in her, that one. Adela put a chisel in her hand the way her grandfather had once put a chisel in hers, and the trade went on. There is an afternoon I would have you see, if you have stayed with me this long, and then I will let the story rest. It is a day in the late summer of 1890, 3 years after a woman in a red shawl raised her hand at an auction and bought a grave for $9. The Madison is running clear and low in the heat, well inside the banks that no man has dared to cut again. The mill on its dressed stone foundation is grinding the valley's wheat into its winter bread, and the sound of it, the deep, patient turning of a wheel that water drives instead of drowns, carries across a meadow that is green again where it was once a sheet of standing silver and then a sheet of cracked gray. Adela Roan stands at the head of the race with her hand on a post, reading the pull of the water the way her grandfather taught her, and beside her a 15-year-old girl, now 18, holds the far end of a level steady against the sill. On the bench inside, where a dead man once chalked figures the river wiped clean, the boxwood rule and the old brass water glass lie ready for the next day's work. And leaning in the corner by the door, worn pale where 3 generations of hands have gripped it now, stands the level. It has shot the line of a cut bank and the line of a courtroom table and the line of a mill brought back from the dead, and it leans there still, plumb and patient, waiting to be picked up. She had bought a drowned thing that no one else would touch, and she had let the water fall, and she had read what it left behind, and a wrong 8 years sunk had risen into the light and been made right, not with a gun and not with a shout, but with a level and a chisel and a summer of patient hands. The valley that had laughed came down in 2s and 3s over those 3 years, to grind their grain at the mill they had called a grave, and not one of them ever said they had been wrong, and not one of them needed to. The wheel said it. The wheel says it still. Did you ever wait years for a buried truth to surface and find that patience was the only tool that could lift it? If a quiet story of a thing set right has stayed with you, there is another like it waiting, of a woman and a ruin and the truth the water gave back.